everyone. Welcome to Challenges for Foundations in the Coming Decade. I'm Ali Hollowell, Chief Strategy Officer at AVPN, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. You'll be excited to know that we have had more than 7,000 people register for the conference over the last week. It's really incredible to see that number continue to grow. For those of you who don't know AVPN, we are a network of funders and resource providers with over 600 members across 32 markets. Our mandate is to move more capital towards impact in Asia by providing social investors like yourself opportunities to connect, learn, and lead. We're also sharing highlights of our day on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so don't forget to share your experience with us by using the hashtag AVPN2020. In today's session, we'll be talking about fundamental shifts that have triggered developments in philanthropy strategy unique to Asia and the West. We'll also be talking about the biggest challenges facing philanthropy in the next decade and how philanthropic organizations can best position themselves for impact in the increasingly turbulent and unpredictable global environment ahead. If you're facing any bandwidth issues, please pause the video by hovering over the face of the speaker to reduce the internet bandwidth. If you're facing any other technical issues, such as difficulties in hearing the speakers, please do not hesitate to reach out to us in the AVPN Tech Help Desk in the link sharing pod. We will be kicking off now, but before we do, I'd like to highlight a few features in this room to keep our conversations lively. To start, please note that this session will be recorded, and you'll be able to access the recording from our conference website. You'll also notice the community chat box, which many of you were using. I've asked you all to introduce yourselves, and I'm glad to see so many people have already done that. If you have any questions for the speakers, we'll be holding a 15-minute Q&A session at the end, so do stay with us until then. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A pod, and we'll select a number of questions for speakers to address at that time. We won't have a chance to get to all questions, but we'll certainly be sharing your questions with the speakers following the session. Finally, to continue chatting with the speakers and fellow delegates in this session, AVPN members and full access ticket holders can make full use of the AVPN connector to chat with fellow delegates after the session. You can find the link in the resource section. So let's get started with a simple activity just to get everybody flowing. It's the end of a long conference day. We'd like to know, in 3 words or less, can you share with us how your organization is dealing with the pandemic? We'll give a few seconds for answers to come in, and then I'll share some of the results. Great. Thank you all for your answers. It definitely seems like there's a lot of people talking about working from home and remotely, and how that's led to a more digital and mobile work style and activities. There's a lot of research happening around public health initiatives and innovation. So I think that that's something that everybody is feeling right now. Thank you for kickstarting us. Okay. So just before we start, I wanted to also mention that AVPN has launched a Funders Pledge, urging social investors to support their investees through this time around flexibility, transparent communication, capacity building, and knowledge sharing. If you're already supporting your investees in this way or looking to do so, please do take the pledge and help to share this message. The link is in the link sharing pod that you'll find after we close this poll. Great. So now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce you to our moderator, AVPN's chairperson and CEO, Ms. Naina Batra. Naina has led AVPN for the past 7 years, and under her leadership, AVPN's membership has grown by more than 4 times and elevated the organization into a truly regional force for good. She's been instrumental in developing AVPN's innovative services that connect, empower, and educate the now 600+ members of AVPN. Naina, over to you.
Thank you, Ali, and good evening if you're joining us today from Asia. Good afternoon if you're joining us from Europe, and good morning if you are joining us from the United States. I think this experience this whole week has been amazing. As Ali mentioned, we have more than 7,000 registered delegates for the AVPN virtual conference, and they have come from more than 80 countries around the world. So I'm never sure which time zone you are in, but it doesn't matter which time zone you're in. I'm really glad and excited for you to join us. on our last session for the Philanthropy Day of the AVPN virtual conference. This morning began with a very interesting newspaper article that got forwarded to me by a number of people. In the New York Times this morning, at least our morning here in Asia, was an article that leading foundations were pledging to give more, hoping to upend philanthropy as a result of the crisis. And I think nothing can be more topical than how are we going to see philanthropists and foundations deal with the coming decade, deal with their strategy, how are they going to relook at how they reinvent themselves in the next 10 years. And to have this discussion, I have three very, very interesting panelists to come in and share their feelings and thoughts with us. Joining me first is Sandra Brecker from the Bosch Foundation. Sandra was appointed to the Board of Management of the Robert Bosch Stiftung in September 2015. Her portfolio includes the Foundation's areas of support, international understanding and cooperation, active citizenship, as well as the Department of Strategic Partnerships and the Robert Bosch Academy. She also supervises the events and operations at the Berlin office. Very excited to have you here, Sandra, with us. My second panelist is someone that we know well here in Asia, drawing on more than 2 decades of experience in philanthropy, government, and the nonprofit sector, and dedicated to understanding the specific barriers and best philanthropic practices associated with impact at scale, Olivia Leyland launched Co-Impact in 2017. Co-Impact is a global philanthropic collaborative that sources and supports locally rooted coalitions working to achieve impact at scale with a focus on gender equality. Prior to Co-Impact, Olivia served as the founding director for the Giving Pledge, an effort launched by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett to help address society's most pressing problems by encouraging wealthy families from around the world to commit the majority of their wealth to philanthropy. And last but not the least, we have Masataka Uo, who is the founder and CEO of the Japan Fundraising Association, a nationwide platform that promotes social impact investment and philanthropic giving in Japan. Masa is also the vice chair of the Japan National Advisory Board for the Global Steering Group for Social Impact Investment and the founder and CEO of Fundrex Co. Limited, a leading consultancy company for social impact organizations. The Social Impact Center at the Japan Fundraising Association performed a pivotal role in creating social impact bond projects, in facilitating social impact measurement initiatives, and supporting high net worth individuals' philanthropic initiatives. So I would like to start this evening with a discussion first with Sandra. Sandra, can I ask you to join me in this chat by putting on your camera and unmuting your mic? Hi, Sandra. Good afternoon. Very nice to have you here at AVPN.
Hi, Naina. Thank you for inviting us. Hello from Berlin. We would have preferred to be there in person, but congratulations to being able to put this conference up in a digital manner since we all cannot come together at this point.
No, we can't. And, you know, that is, it's a perfect segue into the first question that I would like to ask you. So Sandra, what were some of the most fundamental shifts in both the domestic and, of course, the global societal context that have triggered developments in the Foundation's philanthropy strategy, both in Germany and the rest of the world? We are all aware that the Bosch Foundation has been doing a major strategy review over the past few months.
Yes, actually it was over the past 2 years, and I have to tell you that the changes that we at the Robert Bosch Foundation have, and we are a legacy organization, are absolutely radical. We have gone from 34 issues in 5 areas of support to about 10 issues in 3 areas of support, and you can see how radical that is. The biggest catalyst for our strategic review has been the changing international context and also the national domestic context both in terms of major societal challenges, volatility, complexity, as well as in terms of changes in the philanthropic sector. Robert Bosch himself left us with a quite broad portfolio, and over 55 years, that portfolio had evolved strategically, but also organically and in incremental steps. These developments broadened our portfolio considerably over the years, but they also blurred our profile, and we started to lose focus and maybe relevance and impact. So global challenges such as climate change, migration, conflict, anti-democratic sentiment, distrust in institutions, and inequality are shaping our world and have wide-ranging consequences, and we felt that we have to strive to help find solutions to these most pressing societal needs. And with our environment changing so profoundly, it became obvious to us that we had to respond in a future-oriented way, consistent with a legacy, in order to enhance the impact of our work. The second very relevant factor was that philanthropy itself was changing so thoroughly. The significant changes have led to the volume of global philanthropic spending to double in the last 2 decades. The philanthropic landscape has become so much more diverse, and foundations, in particular also legacy foundations, have started to develop new forms of support. We also have to consider that with these developments, the public is more aware and maybe also more critical and questioning the legitimacy and effectiveness of philanthropy. So both these developments led us to initiate the major strategic review, which actually was still based on the legacy of our founder, which was very important to us. We essentially asked ourselves, what would Robert Bosch have seen as the best way to implement his legacy today? What started with the international portfolio was ultimately extended to the whole organization. The process itself was participatory from the very outset, and over a period of almost 2 years, examined the most urgent global changes. Up to 2 years ago, I would never have thought that that was possible. So nothing should be sacred at the beginning of such a process. Maybe just before I end on this question, it's really important to continue to ask how we can change to remain relevant, competitive, and have an impact. And that willingness is absolutely crucial. If it's based on a legacy, you always have the rules. And maybe let me end by saying that our restructuring really meant that we took apart all of our departments and put them together anew. So, changes in the roles, changes in philanthropy led to major and very deep-rooted changes in our foundation.
Wow, that sounds, very, very drastic, and as you said, very bold for any foundation to do. I think it's also very interesting how you went from 55 programs to 10 programs that you were supporting, and looked at really ending sort of all the programs you had in the international, in your international department, which was more than 50%. That is amazing, and to spend 2 years doing this and then come up against COVID, that would have been something that I'm sure was not expected and anticipated. So after this sort of 2-year-long exercise, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected what was decided and sort of the answers that you came to after your 2-year strategy review?
Yes, indeed. What we did was radical. I can tell you we even ended programs that had been running for more than 35 years. I would say that, had we not realigned before, COVID would have forced us to do so. And I'm extremely grateful that we went through this process before, because I think it was easier given the fact that we could travel, we could tap into expertise and knowledge all over the world, not only by our digital means. The pandemic to us is essentially a magnifying glass, I think, to all of us. And the lockdown came at a point when departments were in the process of finalizing the new elaborated strategy. They obviously had to readjust, and we went to a digital and mostly home office format in our work. But luckily, the pandemic has not affected the overall quality of the strategic development. And in terms of content, I would say that it hasn't changed our objectives, but made us focus even more. We closely monitor how COVID affects the issues that we work on, and our long-term strategy is not affected because it is clear that the issues of climate change, peace, migration, inequality, democracy, immigration society, and then our health work in particular. I mean, we as a foundation own a hospital, which is quite unusual, a very large one, and also education are as relevant as they were before, and I would say even more relevant. So we strongly believe that actually the approaches we develop to address these issues are the way forward. In our running programs, we make sure that grantees, partners, and fellows have the flexibility to reallocate funds or postpone program components. And I would say that all of the philanthropic organizations worldwide became more flexible, and we should strive to keep that flexibility post-COVID, definitely, because I think we've seen that we're able to do so and respond quickly. We also committed resources to some initiatives that address the effects of COVID, be it the Solidarity Response Fund of the WHO or contributions to initiatives to support work in refugee camps in Greece. I mean, we as a foundation rarely do humanitarian aid, but in these cases we felt we needed to. Other than that, we feel that we need to wait for a few more months to properly and credibly assess the impact of the pandemic and how we can respond to it within our mission. I've seen this wish by so many philanthropic organizations, and not only those, to really now sort of draw the lessons and interpret what will happen. But if we're very honest, we do not know yet. So I think helping those who are affected, who are already in touch with us, but then also having the patience for a few more months to see what the real effects will be, both economically, socially, and else, to have a proper strategy without going into all kinds of directions was very important.
No, absolutely. And I think I got a couple of really interesting comments that you made when you were talking. And, you said that if you hadn't done this sort of strategy revamp, COVID would have made you do that. And you were really glad that the strategy revamp, in some senses, prepared you for this. You also sort of said that you see the pandemic as a magnifying glass. So what are your reflections, Sandra, as a foundation leader, on how philanthropic organizations can best position themselves for impact as the world becomes increasingly unpredictable and turbulent? I think COVID is just the first of many crises. So what do you think?
Well, I think we've known that before, but maybe we are now more pressed to do what we need to do. I personally feel that clear mission and focus, because no matter how big we as foundations are, and some are bigger than others, we have to be honest, the means are modest. I mean, the biggest part of cross-border giving, for example, are remittances, and those remittances have decreased substantially because of COVID. And while you said today, the great news that some U.S. foundations in particular are doubling down on their efforts, I think philanthropy will see a decrease in funding. So I think mission and focus is extremely important and will become more important. Then I think look at interrelations between issues. As our board chose the issues we work on, it was extremely important that we were able to work on the nexus, to look at how individual issues are interrelated. And we don't mean the sum of it all, because we know everything is connected, but really look as a foundation how you can work on certain issues. I will give you an example. We are now focusing in our migration department mostly on how climate change-induced migration will be affected. So knowing what you want to do is crucial, but it also means knowing what you will not do, and that is sometimes more difficult. Then, as we all know, continuous learning and assessment is extremely important and remains so. And in our introduction, we heard about partnerships. I think partnerships are more critical than ever, both when it comes to collaborating with other funders as well as in the way you work with your partners in the field. We cannot do it alone. The issues are too big, and I think that one of the big issues is obviously partnerships and what we call, stakeholder cooperation, multi-stakeholder cooperation. We all know essentially what we mean by saying that, but I think we are not good at it. So across sectors, cooperating, even though there is often a huge asymmetry, I'll give you the example of a multilateral organization and a foundation. The asymmetry couldn't be bigger, and not everybody has the kind of access that living high net worth individuals have. But learning to work together better will be crucial. And then also acknowledging what sets us apart and what our limitations are. You know, we are in a unique position to be able to take risks, to be independent. We, for example, are nonpartisan, so we are absolutely independent, to take long-term approaches and act flexibly and independently. And I think this is our strength. And on the other hand, still, philanthropy makes, you know, financially in many ways, a very small segment of giving and of money flow in societies. And I think that modesty is important, in particular as the public starts to question legitimacy.
No, I think very, very valid points, and I think very, very useful advice, especially for new philanthropic organizations as they are starting out. I think it's oftentimes more difficult to know what you aren't going to do than what you are going to do, and how are you going to say no when it comes to going away from your focus area. You did mention that, you know, in spite of US foundations talking about doubling down, you feel that the quantum of philanthropy will go down in the coming years. So what do you think are the biggest challenges that will face philanthropy in the next decade?
Yes, and I would say, you know, it's probably the short term, but the short term will be relevant because the needs are bigger. But I guess that, you know, giving will go down if we have a protracted difficult economic situation. This might pick up again within 2 years, but we don't know. I think the urgent global challenges concern all of us. So again, it's cooperating across sectors is absolutely relevant. And I think for that, we as philanthropic organizations are challenged not to be ideological in our approaches. And, you know, I think one of the challenges really is the complexity of the sector. And it's the wealth of the sector on the one hand, and the beauty, and I would say the big advantage. But a lot of what is happening is often ideological. And we have to get better at distinguishing fashionable trends from what is really sustainable change to the better in the sector. And I think we will get better and maybe close some of the gaps. Then philanthropy has to be more representative, both within its institutions and how it represents, whom it represents. And then, you know, our societies are getting more and more polarized. Wherever you look at, whether you look, you know, Western countries or non-Western, it doesn't matter. And that polarization means we have to talk to the other, and we all try, and we all suggest that we are going to have a strategy on doing this. But I think we do mostly keep preaching to the converted and to our own constituencies. And this will be a huge challenge of breaking that down. And then again, I already said that philanthropy itself is becoming more diverse. You know, whether you have huge foundations, high net worth individuals, which do great work, but they're also disruptive to the sector. It's not only, you know, necessarily aiding the sector. And we can see also because of that an increase in public scrutiny. We've seen this over the past weeks, you know, whether it's with some of the theories about where the pandemic came from. And despite this criticism, I'm convinced that the role of foundations of philanthropic organizations in general remains critical. So we have to be proving that by holding ourselves accountable to the very highest standards of transparency and of our work, because the issue of legitimacy is assessed differently in different parts of the world. But I know, for example, in Europe, this question is asked quite a bit. So these are some of the challenges, and then the ultimate issue of impact. How are we really impactful with the modest means and limited means that we have? What kind of partnerships are you know, impactful and bring the best results? And while we all put this down in theory, well, I think you know, within the sector also reaching across the aisle, not being ideological, being open to all kinds of cooperation will be absolutely crucial, but also not promising things that we cannot fulfill.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Sandra. And, you know, if I may now bring in Olivia, Olivia, can I ask you to also switch on your camera and put on your mic, please? So it was interesting. A lot of what Sandra did talk about was also about the importance of cross-sector collaboration and collaboration becoming much more important now, especially post the pandemic. My first question to you is, given that Co-Impact is all about collaboration and being a collaborative pooled fund, how can collaborative philanthropy continue to support systems change even while providing immediate aid, which is the need of the hour?
Right, well, hi Nina, and hi everybody. Thanks for including me here. So I think I'll start first with the second part of the question, which is really this, which I think is crucial, which is how to respond in the immediate and then also to be focused on the long term. And I think, as we've all been talking about, it's so crucial because with the crisis, we're really seeing a case of systems failure. We're seeing this when it's the health systems that are under strain, with economic progress, which is effectively being set back or even erased, and more than 1 billion children out of school. So we absolutely have to do both, which is both respond now and then for the long term. So and also, as you kicked off with, it really is the moment for philanthropy to step up, because this is the time also, especially in contexts and communities which will be hardest hit by the crisis, and especially the most vulnerable and marginalized within those. So I think what we need to do while we're focusing on responding to the crisis is actually looking at what we can do to build back stronger, which means actually strengthening the underlying systems both now and for the longer term. So what that means, I think, is that we need to support efforts through a kind of systems response, which means investing in the locally rooted organizations and the governments and people who have the expertise, relationships, and the context to lead the response efforts. To put this in concrete terms, so instead of, say, philanthropists buying PPE separately and then deciding to deliver it oneself, or buying tablets for online learning and then figuring out how to deliver those, it's about saying, who is it that's actually already working in these areas, in health or education, testing with them what's most needed, and then helping them to strengthen them to deliver and to respond. And it comes back to what you were talking about with Sandra as well, which is basically looking at these coalitions so that these can actually also both respond at scale now, but then also strengthen systems for the longer term. And then on the point of collaborative philanthropy, I mean, I completely agree with what you said, what Matthew said as well here, which is that no single donor or organization really has the capacity or resources to do this alone. And that's actually where collaborative philanthropy comes in, because if we can focus on systemic change, then we can actually start to address some of these major challenges. And this was true pre-COVID as well. It hasn't been a major focus of philanthropy, but my hope is that the crisis actually forces us to recognize, I think, in that Matthew was talking about the severity of the crisis actually forcing us out of our silos. I think that I really hope that will be the case, and that we both focus on the immediate term and the long term in doing that.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. Today in the morning we had a session talking about sort of philanthropy and systems change, and Neera, who you also know well from Dasra, actually made an interesting comment, and she said a lot of philanthropists find systems change to be very complex and therefore find it very difficult to fund systems change. Is that something that you have also seen in your experience, and how has Co-Impact chosen to sort of deal with that, and how do you sort of work at both bringing philanthropists up to speed and because it is really important?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely true, and it is more complex than, say, funding an individual organization, right, that is to go scale its own work. But at the same time, if you actually talk to the social change leaders that are at the forefront of doing this work, they will say, what I spend my time thinking about is how do you actually address things at a systems level of scale? And how do you get at the root causes? How do you make it that it's not just about scaling one organization, but it's about saying, how do you actually fundamentally transform a system for the long term? So what that means is actually philanthropy does need to do that, right? If it's actually about lasting change. And so the way that we do that, I mean, part of what the reason I started Co-Impact was actually to make it so that philanthropists who were focused on this, and also ones that would like to be and would like an efficient way of actually getting involved in systems change, can do that by joining us and supporting the efforts where we have an experienced team that goes and finds sources and then supports these efforts. So it is about that, and that's actually what we're looking to do. I do think, even without working through an effort like ours, where you actually can go and find and support these, there are pieces of it, which are things like going and actually asking the organizational leaders, what is it that we can do to help support you for the long term? So some of it is actually just about long term. What can we do to help you to build partnerships that are needed in order to address things at a systems level? So I think starting with some of those questions is key, and then obviously figuring out more and more what one can do in philanthropy to work on systems change.
Thank you. So on a personal level, how has the pandemic affected your development strategy for Co-Impact?
It was really interesting to see the responses that came in. I was trying to capture them all at the beginning in the piece. So you described a bit about what we do. I'll give a very quick overview of what Co-Impact is, just if people don't know us. So we are a global philanthropic collaborative, and we focus on systems change, as you were saying, Nina, and on supporting impact at scale. And we bring together funders to do that in the areas of health, education, and economic opportunity in the global south. And we make relatively long-term, large-scale grants to coalitions that are working towards systemic change. So how has the pandemic affected us? And I think particularly, obviously, through the work of our partners, it's affected all of us, right, in so many ways. Some are focused on health systems, and they're being called on by governments to be part of the national and international responses to the pandemic. Others are working on youth employment, extreme poverty, education. Everybody's being severely affected. I think, obviously, they're working to respond and to adapt while keeping the focus on the long term, and as I was mentioning earlier. In terms of our strategy, it really comes down to doubling down on what we're doing, reinforcing the focus on systems, figuring out how we can partner with the efforts that we're supporting. And I think what I believe strongly is now is not the time to pivot. On the contrary, it's actually the time. The scale of the crisis is so significant and it really is further exacerbating a lot of the injustices and social inequalities that we see in society and that our partners are working to address. And so this work is even more important now. So having philanthropy respond in a significant way is key. I'll highlight a few things in terms of our response very quickly as to what I mean. So one is obviously core to our model is actually building on what works rather than necessarily starting things that are new, and actually saying what is it that actually is working, how do we support efforts that are working in partnership with others to address issues for millions of people. And this applies to the COVID response, which is, I think, especially as we look at the direct response efforts, what is that we can do in terms of learning from before while also adapting and supporting these locally rooted entities and organizations that have the understanding and the context to deploy the resources most effectively. So that's one piece. The second is on which I think this would probably be a common theme across, but is this point about really focusing on coalitions. Because, and we were talking about the multi-stakeholder response, I mean, that's what we do, which is actually to support not just individual organizations, but coalitions that are coming together to tackle issues at scale. And I think that's more and more crucial. One piece I would add to this, which is also because the crisis is so significant, it also is going to be more and more important to ensure that we're hearing different voices and that we're also, in our support, gathering feedback from different stakeholders. And so this piece of both the coalitions and also ensuring that we are gathering the feedback and getting the ideas to be able to adapt is going to become, I think, more and more key. And then finally, and I know you had a whole day devoted to this, but our focus is on advancing gender equality. And I think what this pandemic shows more and more is basically highlighting the inequalities and further exacerbating them. And so for us, it's about doubling down on that focus and really saying, how do we address both in everything from the problem analysis through program design, measurement, leadership, and more, and recognize how profoundly gendered the pandemic actually is. So one final thing, because you mentioned also the pledge, which I think is really important. I do think there are things that I hope stick and that we are looking at. I mean, for us as Co-Impact, we're some of our core principles are about trusting and following the lead of our partners, being flexible with our deadlines while obviously keeping the results and the outcomes core, but the way to get there can be flexible, and then listening to our partners. And so I think there is a moment now in philanthropy, I think, where we're saying this is needed. How can we come together to do that? So we're part of other groups that are doing that and saying, how do we talk about what are the pieces here that we can then not just do now, but then do over the longer term as the crisis unfolds, and as you talked about, as we see further crises in the future as well. Those are some of the things that I would have.
Thank you, Olivia. And I think a lot of those points really sort of resonated with me. Definitely, this is not the time to sort of, go into hibernation, but it is the time to scale. And I really, really liked what you said. This is also the time to listen to your stakeholders. I mean, too often we don't anyway in philanthropy. And, how do we make sure that now, in a time of crisis, we are actually listening to people on the ground? Before I actually, bring Masa into the conversation, I want to ask all of you who are listening to us speak to actually, answer a poll for us. So in your opinion, how has your organization shifted your funding strategy due to COVID-19? And in your opinion, what do you feel is the biggest need from philanthropy in this climate? It'll be good for us to spend maybe 2 minutes just answering those questions. I think it was very interesting what both Sandra and Olivia said about, that if it weren't for the pandemic, the Bosch Foundation would have, if they hadn't switched their strategy or hadn't relooked at their strategy, the pandemic would have made them do that. And what Olivia said about, really doubling down on their focus, making sure that they listen to stakeholders, and now much more than any other time, it being very, very important that we look at how we address inequality. So we're getting some very interesting points in terms of how organizations have shifted their funding strategy. I think right from no real change to becoming giving to more immediate needs rather than program funding, to actually looking at a systems approach to ensure that things other than COVID are still being looked at. And what do people think is the biggest need from philanthropy in this climate? More funding, staying committed to the longer term, funding to support the marginalized, commitment for the longer term, absolutely, unrestricted funding, flexible funding, collective action. I think all of these are really, really important. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll close the poll for now because we are kind of running short of time and I want to get to all the questions as well. So I now want to move to my third panelist, Masataka Oo. Masa-san, would you start your camera and unmute yourself, please? Masa, can you unmute? I think you're still on mute. Perfect. I can't hear you yet, so could you make sure your mic is on? Give us a second and we'll, cannot hear you, Masa-san. Just if we can make sure your mic, I don't think your mic is showing up yet. No, we're not able to hear you. Maybe if you can just go in and come back out and we can switch to some of the questions for now. I think while we get your mic working, that would be good. Okay, so still not being able to hear you. Maybe if you just log off and log on again, I think that might work. Yes. So while we're waiting for Masa-san to come back on, maybe I'll just go to a couple of questions. So I have a question. I have a question for Olivia here. There's a question here asking you whether if you're locally relevant, so if you're working on locally relevant issues, does that conflict at all with impacting on scale? Olivia, could you take that question while we wait for Masa-san? So I think the question is,
can you hear me?
Being locally relevant conflicting with impacting on scale? You need to put your mic on.
I think that's a really important question because impact at scale can't happen unless it's locally relevant, I would advocate. So I think part of this actually does come back specifically to the point of actually ensuring that even as you work on things at scale, that it is about getting the feedback from the communities that the philanthropy is actually intended to be supporting, because I think it's something that otherwise could be a risk, right, of actually saying let's work on things that millions you get distracted by that rather than actually focusing on what the voices are of people who would actually say what's needed. So I think the short answer is it has to be both, and there are ways to ensure that. And I think this also comes down to where coalitions are important, because that way you actually can include more of the locally rooted organizations as well as other maybe international organizations, multilaterals, others that are actually all working on this along with philanthropists, and be able to do both.
Thank you, Olivia. And can I have Sandra? I have a question for you as well. So Sandra, the question is that the impact of philanthropy is the key, though it is the key for social transformation. Do you believe that it will impact the non-profit organization significantly as well? Do you think that it's important for philanthropy to not just impact social transformation, but also impact the non-profit organization that you're working through as well?
Well, actually, I think it's I would say we work with partners, so we do hope that actually the impact is both ways. So, whatever we can provide in support, both financial and other, will hopefully support their development and impact what our partners do in the NGO sector, in the NGO world. But whoever we work with will impact us. We are both operational and grant making, which is I think one of our strengths, because we do our own programs, we know what it means to be doing your own programs, and we're also grant making. And we have seen that combination has been extremely enriching both ways. So yes, our support, it's not only systemic change in the broad term, but also in the NGO sector. But we are also the recipient of a lot of benefits from those partnerships.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that. We have Masa-san back now. Masa-san, is your mic working now? Can we try? Perfect. So should we move on to asking you the question now? So let's transition to Masa-san, and so So I wanted to ask you the question in terms of how, could you share a background with us of how philanthropy has grown in Japan, and what do you think is the importance of legacy giving in Japan? Unfortunately, I still can't hear you.
Masa-san, at the top of your screen where the microphone is, if you click on the drop-down little arrow and just say connect to the microphone, you can, or sorry, select microphone. Just make sure it's coming through to the correct microphone. No, we still can't hear you.
Is Murphy's Law. It works in the sound check, but it doesn't work on the actual program. I'm going to actually go back to the questions while our tech team helps Masa-san in the back. So if we can have Olivia and Sandra up on screen as well right now, and we'll just go back to question and answers while we work through with Masa-san separately. Sorry about this, guys. It's unfortunate that we're having some of these technical issues. Okay, so I have a question from Dado from the Seagull Family Foundation. The success that philanthropy seeks to see is also very much dependent on how philanthropy works. Philanthropy seeks to address imbalances and inequities, but is still very built on the same colonial model that solves issues for and of others, often without including everyone. The conversations have not been so much on undoing its own biases and processes that lead to success. What is the best way to hold philanthropy accountable? So I think, Sandra, you mentioned some of this when we were talking a little bit earlier about how the current situation is asking for philanthropists, specifically individual philanthropists, to be held more accountable, and questioning the legitimacy of them making all the decisions. So I'll first ask you, what do you think of that question?
Well, it's a very relevant question, and it's extremely difficult. I mean, it may be easy to answer in theory, but not so easy to respond in practice. I think we, in terms of the partnerships that we have to have the highest degree of participation, and that was said before. And I know that Olivia also mentioned that, and the highest degree of, trying to defer decisions and decision making. However, we have to be doing this in a very honest manner, because I personally believe that, we have to be honest what we can allow to be transferred to others in terms of the legal framework that we work in, and what is possible and what is not possible. So I think transparency and honesty is extremely important, because if you suggest that everything will be fully participatory and it is not, it's much worse than being honest. I think that, in terms of whom we represent and how we represent and the issues that we work on, we have to try to ensure the highest degree of representation within our foundation. That is a huge challenge, particularly we already have one of the biggest issues. We have one of, a big issue, for example, if I look at our foundation, I mean, how are we representative of German society, of our domestic environment, but how in the world can we be representative of where we work internationally? And that is only possible by the highest degree of income of expertise, of exchange on all levels, and we have to question each and every step that we take. But be honest that, not everything will be perfect. But that degree of diversity and representation within our own bodies and in the partnerships that we have, the broadest way. And as I said before, you have to have controversial voices in each and every partnerships and actors. If we only work with converted, or if we only work with like-minded, or if we only work with the ideologically aligned, it's going to be very difficult to have change. And we've seen this over the past years. It is a big question. But, for example, I will tell you something. We are, a private foundation associated with a private company. If we work on inequality, that will invariably be a question. And we have to say that we will be as transparent as we can and as open as we can. But we also have to acknowledge where our limitations are. And I think that acknowledgement is already very helpful in many ways.
Thank you for that, Sandra. I agree. And, just now bouncing that to Olivia, I mean, what do you think? I mean, in terms of sort of looking at privilege and where it plays a role in philanthropy, how has Co-Impact sort of looked at sort of addressing some of those issues around the legitimacy of philanthropists and, sort of seeing how does philanthropy itself build equality both within themselves and the decisions that philanthropists make?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a crucial question, and I think one of the things it comes down to is actually fundamentally recognizing that philanthropy is not the one that's actually driving the change and shouldn't be. And so it's actually, I think sometimes we like to think that it's, in philanthropy that it's about that, but actually the more that philanthropy can kind of take one seat at the table and then actually be more in the support role and have the partners be in the lead around what's needed, and to create that dynamic of trust, which obviously is hard to do. I think one of the things that helps with that is actually longer term funding, because actually then you are in it together for longer term. And so you have that space for partners to say what is and isn't working in terms of the way of providing support. And then also building in mechanisms for accountability. So I saw that was one of the other questions, which is sort of how do we do that in philanthropy? How do we make sure that we're getting feedback on a regular basis and asking for it? The other thing I would just say is that obviously even our partners may also, one of the other things is with the partners also to be continually looking as well at how to be addressing some of the structural inequities in society. So it is not just for philanthropy, but it's also for the organizations and efforts that we're supporting to be, so that we're all thinking about this together. And I think that also comes back to trying to think about how do you get constant feedback. How do you also think about issues of gender, of inclusion? How do you make that something which doesn't just happen at kind of one piece of, maybe it often happens around kind of evaluation or measurement, but how do you do that from the outset in terms of design and building in space for kind of really grappling with this at each step of the philanthropic process.
Nana, I think you're muted.
Thanks for that, Olivia. It's interesting how a lot of the questions are around, talking about inequality and talking about how does philanthropy actually make sure that it addresses all the stakeholders on the ground. One of the other questions that has actually come up is around capacity building, and what is the role that capacity building plays in your sort of interactions with your funders, with your grantee organizations. So Olivia, could you start by telling us a little bit about how Co-Impact builds capacity building in terms of the work that it does with its grantee organizations?
Sure. So actually with our partners, what we actually do is we ask the question of what they want to have as organizational strengthening, and then provide actual funding and support to do that. Some of it might come from us, some of it will come from external partners. And I think that the main thing that we try to do is actually provide, because our funding is longer term and also intended to be around this kind of systems oriented vision, it's to be able to say, what can we do to give you that space for sort of the strategic coherence that's needed to be able to do that. And so what are the things to do from a capacity standpoint that will help with that. So obviously with this, there could always, sometimes I think as funders, we would like to say, well, here's we need you to build your capacity in this or that. And generally our premise is that there are a few things obviously that we feel strongly about, but actually over the longer term, you can face them at different points. But basically it's up to the partners to say, this is what we need, here's how we'd like you to support us. And actually, if you look at the data, there's not that much funding that actually goes to organizational strengthening, to capacity building, to kind of this more flexible funding. I think we are seeing, I think that's one of the things with the crisis that we are seeing more of people saying, actually, let's see what we can do around this, which I think is a real positive, which is what more philanthropy can do along these lines. Again, with the partners really in the lead around saying, yes, we do need this or we don't need this, and here's who could help us with it as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Olivia. Sandra, what about you? How important is capacity building when you are looking at supporting programs or working in sort of, the sectors that you support, even post your strategy review? Is capacity building going to be a part of the work that you will do going forward?
Yes, I can only second what Olivia already said and support that, because I think that's also part of our strategy. And I have to also say that we have come around to being much more open to institutional funding, which I think is also building capacity, which allows organizations to work in the mid and long term, because it's people and institutions that change the world, and it's not necessarily projects. So we feel that we have to be responsive to the needs of our partners, and actually they help us build our capacity too in this partnership. And then the way we structure our funding and what we fund and what the conditions are, I think also very much help building capacity, because if you don't have the I would say traditional donor-driven mechanisms of funding, it changes, I think, the nature of the partnership. And we have moved to being much more institutional funding, open to institutional funding than we were before.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. We're going to try one more time with Masa-san to see if we can get him online. I can see that his mic is now on. So if we could then switch to Masa-san on, to have him up, please. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we
can. You hear me? Okay,
yes, we can.
now I'm back. I'm sorry about this. I'm sorry for this tech issue. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Not at all.
Yes, last one. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Masa from Japan, and thank you very much for this great opportunity. I'm sorry for this technical problem. But I think that this COVID-19 situation is terrible, but it's also the great opportunity for us leaders in philanthropic sector to change the paradigm of people and to change the mindset of people. And in order to achieve that in Japan's situation, I think the key thing is to attract more high net worth individuals to start philanthropy. And thanks to the support of ABPN, we are going to set up a new platform in which we invite innovative and proactive family philanthropists to sit together and working together collaboratively and collectively in Japan. This is the first of its kind in Japan to provide a comprehensive support. And we're going to set it up by October this year. And because of this COVID-19, many people feel empathy on social isolation and poverty, inequality, etc. So we'd like to build back better in our society. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Before I let you go, can you just tell us, how has philanthropy grown in Japan? Can you give us a quick snapshot. I mean, I know we talked a lot about this and it was very interesting, and especially about the work that Japan Fundraising Association and you yourself have done. I think a lot of our audience would be very keen to know.
Yeah, very quickly, whenever we have natural disasters, we experience the big shift in philanthropy. This is kind of build back better. And for example, in Kobe earthquake in 1995, we had a terrible earthquake in Kobe, and we got 1.3 million volunteers in Kobe earthquake. And after that, we see the big change, big shift in volunteering. And in tsunami in 2011, we have more than 70% donors from Japan to give back to victims. And it's widely recognized as a turning point in giving in a society. So likewise, I think that this COVID-19 situation will also change the paradigm of the people. And in Japan's case, because we are a very aging society, legacy giving is really, really important issue. And now, every year, inherited asset is roughly 370 to 460 billion US dollars a year. Wow. And 20% of them want to give back to community. So next question is who will support them to actually set up foundation, donor advised fund, impact investment fund. So this is the reason why we set up a new platform in Japan to help them to do that.
Thank you for that. It seems as if from what you were describing, earlier philanthropy was very much triggered by natural disasters. Do you feel that is sort of changing now in Japan, with legacy giving becoming more important? Do you feel that there is now a different sort of wave in terms of how philanthropy can support the government in meeting the SDGs?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to work for JICA and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm now advisor to JICA right now also. I know a thing or two about the government, but I personally think that the very important thing is that if the government can solve everything, that will be great. And the key really matter is that who will lead social innovation and lead creativity to create impact. And I think that non-profit sector and the philanthropists can take risks and behave flexible to try new solution and get the evidence from this kind of social experiment. So this is a very important role. So I think that the philanthropic sector not only supporting government but also leading government to make them become more cost-effective and impactful.
Thank you. I know that we are almost out of time, so it's a very positive note to actually end Philanthropy Day. So thank you so much for that, Masa-san. That if not for philanthropy, who is going to take the risk to support some of the most challenging issues that we are facing as a planet? So thank you very much to Masa-san, to Olivia, and to Sandra for being part of this interesting panel and for sharing their insights. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today in spite of a few technical struggles. I'm going to now hand it back to our MC, Ali.
Thanks, Naina.
Thank you
to all of our speakers. It was wonderful to hear from all of you, and thanks to everybody for sticking with us through the technical challenges. I'm so glad we got to hear Masa-san in the end. Before we conclude, we'd just like for all of you to participate in a quick survey to share feedback on the session. And while people are filling out that survey, I'd just like to say a final announcement as we've come to the close of Philanthropy Day and the session Challenges for Foundations in the Coming Decade. I'd like to thank our lead partners, Chandler Foundation, Stockholm Environment Institute, and Edan Prize, as well as our knowledge partners and impact partners. Remember that if you'd like to continue chatting with the speakers and fellow delegates in the session, please make full use of the AVPN connector. The link can be found in the resource section, which is not currently showing because of the poll, but at the end of the session we'll have a closing slide with links for you to access that, or you can reach it through the AVPN website. We do ask that you share your highlights with us. We're loving all of the activity happening on social media throughout this week. Keep using that hashtag AVPN 2020. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.